Hi, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Metropolitan Republican Club. My name is Krisha Lenzo, and on behalf of the Met Club Board, we're so happy to have you join us this evening. Tonight, as you might recall, we have a link in our live chat, and we hope you'll consider making a contribution to our club during this critical election cycle, which is still very much underway. So now I'd like to turn it over to my colleague, Kelly, who will do the introduction.
So thanks, Krisha. So tonight, we're happy to introduce Chris McDaniel, Mississippi State Senator and 2014 U.S. Senate candidate. In 2014, State Senator McDaniel was a Tea Party-backed candidate for the U.S. Senate who narrowly lost the Republican nomination to Senator Thad Cochran in a runoff election. McDaniel was vocal about his intention to repeal Obamacare if elected and his desire to lower the national debt. The Republican primary was described as a contest between the party establishment and the Tea Party Grassroots for the soul of the grand old party. In the primary, McDaniel received 49.6% of the vote, and Cochran received 49% of the vote, leading to a runoff. In the primary, leading to a runoff, which McDaniel lost 49% to Cochran's 51%. In the aftermath, the McDaniel campaign presented evidence that 3,000 Democrats had voted in the GOP primary and that further fraud had been committed. The investigation that McDaniel campaign called for was supported by Senator Ted Cruz. The Mississippi lower courts rejected access to the poll books, and eventually the state Supreme Court dismissed the case. Thank you, Senator McDaniel, for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So our first question tonight is, how hard was it for you to prove the allegations of fraud that you made in your election for the U.S. Senate in 2014? And how hard do you think it will be for President Trump to prove similar allegations for the presidential election this year?
Well, as an initial matter, in 2014, it was very unique in the sense that we were talking about only a Republican primary. Now, keep that in mind. And you look at primaries differently than you look at general elections. The Republicans are a private club. The Democrats are a private club. And it would seem absolutely silly for members of one club to elect the nominees or the directors or the officers of the other club, which is precisely what happened in Mississippi back in 2014. So what happened is, among Republican votes that night, we received about 60% of the vote. So presumably, with that being the case, I would have been the nominee for the Republican Party in that U.S. Senate race. However, clearly, Thad Cochran was a very powerful politician and had many qualities about him. The one thing that was abnormal about that race was their ability, and actually illegally in some respects, to bring in Democrats into a Republican primary to tilt the race in Senator Cochran's favor. And it wasn't just 3,000 Democrats. Upwards of 40,000 Democrats in the Delta and in Hinds County participated in a Republican primary. Now, here's the thing. The illegality that we saw, in large part, were direct crossover votes. And that's a bit complicated. What that means is, if you voted in the actual election before the runoff, that is in the primary, then certainly you may cast a vote in the runoff. If you did not vote, you may cast a vote in the runoff. But if you voted in the Democrat primary during the regular race, you couldn't then cross over and vote in the Republican runoff. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So what we saw is several hundred, if not several thousand people just directly transferred over and voted in the Republican runoff. Okay, but that was just the tip of the iceberg, because bear in mind, there were thousands of others that were Democrats in voting and Democrats by trade, and they still voted in a Republican primary, and that's how Senator Cochran won. Now, as to the specifics of the fraud and the illegal conduct, it just runs whatever human imagination can bring to the table. People will find a way to cheat, right? Mm-hmm. And so we saw all sorts of that activity in that race. And likewise, we're seeing it in this particular race with President Trump as well.
Thank you so much for explaining that. And Kelly's intro, obviously, we wanted to lay out the scene for our audience members to truly understand what you experienced. So now, obviously, looking towards the presidential election, Senator Ted Cruz and some Tea Party-backed groups have said, have called for an investigation into the fraud and the runoff after you had been ahead in the election on election day. What was the investigation like, and what advice would you give President Trump's lawyers as they're looking into this fraud in the 2020 election?
That's a great question. What they're going to find is, as they push up against these Democrat states, or at least states that are split down the middle, and you find strong Democrats in positions of authority, that's essentially like pushing back against the established order. And what you're going to find there, say, for example, in Pennsylvania, where you have this very vocal lieutenant governor there, who every day has been just vocally adamant that Trump has no proof and that they've done nothing wrong. You're pushing back against an established order. And when that happens, you may not believe this. This is going to blow your minds, but even judges, men and women that aren't supposed to be biased at all or prejudiced at all, find themselves very biased under the circumstances. Even prosecutors, you'd be shocked at what they'll turn a blind eye to when it benefits their party or their power structure. Because naturally, if it benefits their power structure, then ultimately, at some point in the future, it may likewise benefit them. So what you find is, even when you find fraud or criminal activity or what's called irregularities, it's pretty easy to find on, particularly in sporadic locations. The question is, can you find sufficient activity to overcome a pretty sizable lead that right now Joe Biden has in some of these areas? That's going to be the difficulty, especially when every place you turn for relief, you're getting pushback from the apparatus. You're getting pushback from the establishment. So proving fraud, first of all, is very difficult because of the people that are perpetuating the fraud do it in a wise way. It's just hard to catch. That's the nature of fraud. But if they do it and they are caught, then you still have to pray that you're going to have some relief somewhere with some unbiased judge or unbiased prosecutor. And that can be very difficult to find.
Definitely. That makes total sense, especially with the many varied evidence and cases of fraud that we've seen so far mentioned in the past week since the election on November 3rd. So going off that, what do you think of the specific allegations of fraud that have been brought forth, such as over 100,000 ballots being dumped all for Joe Biden in Wisconsin, or the faulty voting machine software in Michigan, allegations of dead people voting in various states, backdating ballots in Mississippi by the postal worker, and just overall issues with the mail-in ballots, particularly in a state like Pennsylvania, based on your own experience, both running for office and what you know in general about election law?
I can tell you, fraud does occur. Irregularities do occur. If you believe otherwise, you just haven't paid attention to our history in this country. You know, you think, for example, in 1960, there are pretty valid accusations about how Kennedy won that race against Nixon, particularly in boxes in Chicago. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. If you've had elections, you've had fraud, you've had illegal activity. The question is now, can we find it and prove it? And that's the difficult part of it. Now, one part of the case that's really interesting, and I saw Byron York did an article on it today, in Pennsylvania. Take a look at the article, because the real question there is the votes that came in after that legislative set deadline, which I think was 8 o'clock on election night, the mail-in ballots that came in after that, the question is legally, can they still be counted? Now, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court just seemed to ignore the legislature, which was interesting, going back to that first point I made earlier, because the legislature seems to indicate you have a hard and fast deadline, statutorily. The Supreme Court seemed to ignore that. And they said, oh, yeah, we'll allow it for this extraordinary occasion. Well, the law is the law. And as conservatives, we look at the law, and those words mean what they say. You know, you think about this great debate we just had in the Supreme Court between originalism and this living Constitution. If the words mean what they say in Pennsylvania, then the argument is that those votes that came in after that deadline should not count. But the liberals on the court are saying, well, trust us, we're better legislators than you are. We'll recreate the law if we need to have success. So again, there may be merit initially to the argument. The question is, can you get those judges to buy into it? And if you do that in Pennsylvania, all of a sudden that margin, it shrinks considerably. As to the other accusations, what I'll say about that is they seem problematic, certainly. And Trump's got some really good lawyers out there working right now. And I think my understanding is he's going to let some of this information out next week. And so we'll be beyond the realm of speculation and more into actual data. And that's kind of what I'm waiting to see next week. But do I believe there was fraud? Yeah, absolutely. It's an American election. There's always going to be some degree of fraud. So it did occur, certainly.
Well, to your point, this is not necessarily unprecedented in our history that we've had fraud. And certainly about in terms of a recount, we saw in Bush v. Gore, back in 2000. This is not something that's necessarily new. What's the difference now, though, versus in 2000?
The difference primarily is you have more states in play, naturally. But as far as the fundamental aspect of whether we're getting fair elections, it's the same thing. Bear in mind that Americans need to believe. We need to believe that our system is working. Core to that system is the ability of Americans to vote in their elected officials. If for whatever reason we lose faith in that ability, then the very foundations of the country begin to crumble, because you lose faith in that these elected leaders are elected at all. And then it begins to beg the question, well, who elected them? It must be an established order. It must be someone else, not the people. And so when you're talking about trying to find fraud or irregularities, that should be encouraged. And I saw CNN earlier, and CNN said that somehow Trump is undermining the democratic process. That is such nonsense. If you're trying to preserve free and fair elections, by definition, you're strengthening the democratic process. Because if you have unfair elections, you can't truly have a representative democracy. So what Trump is doing, he's strengthening our case. He's strengthening our democracy by affirming, hopefully, that justice can be done here. And so I encourage the investigation. I think it's the right thing to do under the circumstances.
Definitely. And we're hoping that the investigation yields positive results, and hopefully in a timely manner as well, given that there's only a little bit more than 2 months until Inauguration Day in January. So going off that, what was the runoff like in your election for the Senate in 2014? Obviously, there's a lot of talk about the runoffs in Georgia coming up in January. And how do you foresee the 2 Senate runoffs there for David Perdue and Kelly Loeffler will play out?
When you ask about runoffs, first of all, I had a really bad experience. So naturally, I'm very antagonistic toward runoffs. But yet they are part of the system, and I appreciate that. In short, it's a nightmare. You think about it, particularly in 14 in our race, where we have this lead, and it's presumed that you're going to easily prevail in the runoff. And the national polling showed us taking a substantial lead. And when that occurs, the powers that are threatened, they really get mean. I mean, you have to understand what's going to go down in Georgia over the next 2 or 3 weeks. If they can allege something, they're going to allege it. If they're going to accuse somebody of something, they're going to accuse it. It's going to be as nasty as it gets, because you're not just fighting now for a single Senate position. In theory, you're fighting for control of the Senate. Not only are you going to see tons of money pour into Georgia, but tons of really nasty people and tons of nasty actors. And they're going to say things and behave in ways that make everybody incredibly uncomfortable. Now, with that said, I do believe the Republicans have a slight edge in Georgia. Different reasons for that. I think naturally Georgia is still, in my mind, more of a red state. They did a great job in Atlanta and some urban areas and getting the mail-in ballots there, for example. But what you'll find when you run state races like Senate races, more localities will come into bear at that stage. What I mean by that is these individual personalities, people they know, family members they've had throughout the state, they'll come to bear as well. I think the races will be close, but I think the Republicans will win those races in short.
So we were at the Met Club, even just today, I am getting texts from friends saying, how can I get involved in Georgia? What can I do in this Senate runoff? How can we help?
Well, several ways. In every race like this, where you see the entire country begin to focus on a single state, you're going to see a lot of operatives fly into that state. Some operatives are not to be trusted. They'll try to get your money. They'll try to take advantage of email lists, whatever the case may be. But the trusted operatives the campaign have hired and work for the campaign, it would be a good idea to reach out, for example, and begin to make phone calls. They have computer automated systems now where you can sit in New York or sit in Alabama and make phone calls on behalf of candidates to Georgia. There are several ways you can help. Naturally, they want your money. Obviously, every political campaign wants money terribly. So just know before you reach out, you're going to be inundated with tons of requests for finances. But between direct phone calls, financing, and if you're really aggressive, get in your car, get on a plane, drive down to Georgia, get involved and go door to door. It's going to be a ton of door to door activity in this state over the next 2 or 3 weeks. And frankly, that's a really positive way to make an impact on people. When they see young folks going door to door and they get to meet these young people and see their passion for a candidate, it can really be persuasive for sure.
That's great. And I think we're thinking of perhaps doing something like that, a little road trip down there.
Be fine. Yeah, for sure.
So we'll
don't waste your time in Atlanta. It's not going to work out too well for you.
Yeah, we'll go to the more rural areas that are
Absolutely.
So going off that, what do you think of Georgia Governor Brian Kemp? Obviously, he won in a very close race in 2018, 2 years ago, and his Secretary of State's handling of the vote counting process in the presidential election. And then what about today's announcement of the hand recount in Georgia? Obviously, lots of updates going on there.
Yeah, that's good news. I mean, anytime you can get a hand recount, in theory, that's going to be a bit more accurate. Now, granted, it depends in large part on who actually is counting the ballots. Mm-hmm. And if the poll watchers can be there and if there's fairness involved, that should help a bit. As far as watching this internal squabble between the Secretary of State and the governor and the 2 U.S. senators, it's been fascinating, but I'm really not familiar enough with all the details to comment on that. I would hate to step on too many toes. It's just my understanding that am I right about this, that he was asked to resign by members of his party? Is that an accurate assessment of what's occurring in Georgia?
I'm not sure, but I know there were a lot of calls against him. I think that the 2 Senate candidates were not happy with what's gone on.
They are not. They're very displeased. And, look, they have a lot on the line. And so I don't blame them for being displeased. I just don't know quite enough about the details of why specifically they're displeased. Maybe a recount would go a long way in defining exactly what happened in Georgia. But I'll tell you this, being a Southerner, watching Georgia float away from a Republican president was incredibly disappointing. Maybe it's time we build a wall around Atlanta, make Atlanta pay for it. What do you think?
The perimeter, as they call it.
Just the perimeter. Yeah, we'll make it a separate state or whatever. But no, Georgia's still a fine state, and there are good people there. It's just that get out the vote effort they had in Atlanta was pretty monumental.
Well, you mentioned that politics, may have played a role in terms of the outcome with respect to the courts and your election and the runoff. How do you foresee politics playing a role in the court's interpretations of the allegations of fraud for President Trump's,
It will play a big role. I mean, in theory, we give federal judges lifetime appointments because theoretically speaking, they're supposed to be insulated from the political process. Mm-hmm. That really hasn't worked as anticipated. The founders, I'm not saying they're wrong about that. I'm just saying it hasn't quite worked the way they thought it would. So what you find now is a hyper-politicized federal judiciary. And Republicans and conservatives, unfortunately, over the years have allowed this to exist, allowed this to become part of our law where these black-robed kings and queens make decisions that the legislature should be making. And so they actually begin to usurp more power and become more powerful than the federal judiciary was ever meant to be. Well, because they are so involved in politics and because they are part of the appointment process, politics will play a role. My fear is take, for example, Justice Roberts. You might remember Justice Roberts was one of the so-called conservative jurists that moved over and joined the liberal bloc, basically validating the Obamacare a few years ago. Remember that? Mm-hmm. To do that, Justice Roberts had to literally rewrite legislation. He was too clever by half. If you look at the dissent in that case, the dissents, I should say, in that case, they point out pretty dramatically how Roberts was wrong. So it begs the question, why would the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court take an action that way when he was appointed by a Republican president and presumably as a conservative? And their answer is, perhaps he's trying to cement his legacy. Perhaps he's the ultimate politician. Perhaps in many, many ways, he was just trying to make sure that his court, his name, somehow escaped criticism, even if that criticism was criticism worthy of the position. Because naturally, I don't think there's a conservative in the world at the time that believed Obamacare was was constitutional. The individual mandate was unprecedented, and the only way they could find it to be constitutional is through the taxing authority. He had to rewrite the law to get there. So the point I'm making is Roberts naturally was influenced by politics and not the law, because if you're an originalist, like Amy's going to be, like Gorsuch is, like Scalia was, and like Thomas is, if you're an originalist, passion and prejudice and bias and all of these things about politics, you don't have to be concerned about that. Is it allowed under the Constitution? That's the question. Textually, from the standpoint of history, Roberts did not follow that tradition. He went another direction. That's politics, and that's what happens. And that's unfortunate because these judges are not supposed to be influenced by politics. So I say all that to say this. Roberts, I'm concerned about. Kavanaugh, I'm concerned about. We'll see what happens.
Oh, wow. Even Kavanaugh, despite everything, the questioning of him by Kamala.
Look, listen, you're right. If I'm Kavanaugh, here's the thing. I would never let something personal like that get in the way of my job as a judge. My job is to do justice impartially, impassionately, look at the Constitution and make a tough call. I want him to do that because if he does, I think he'll make a wise decision. I think he's a very good judge and obviously a brilliant person. My concern with Kavanaugh, and it may be completely wrong, and if it is, I'll be the first one to apologize. Sometimes these justices go to D.C. and they join the cocktail circuit. Right. I'm not saying he is. I'm just saying that when you're rubbing shoulders with powerful moderates and powerful liberals and you want to be accepted by them, traditionally we have seen justices who were appointed begin to move to the left. And that's almost inexplicable because when they're first appointed, you can sense their conservative credentials. And the longer they stay in D.C., they shift to the left. My concern with Kavanaugh is that possible shift to the left. Now, I pray I'm wrong. Right. Because if we can keep him, it doesn't matter what Roberts does. We still hold the majority of 5 conservative votes. So I pray I'm wrong about that, and time will tell. But look, we'll see.
Sure.
Definitely. And we were even seeing news today that he, along with Roberts, might not end up voting to repeal Obamacare in this new case that's coming to the court in the next year. So
I'm glad you said that. That's what raised my red flags because if you're talking, okay, so Roberts, first of all, now this was all during oral argument, so you never know how they're actually going to rule. So we may be being very unfair to them. But the questions they asked during oral argument seem to indicate they will leave the remainder of the law standing, even though the individual mandate has basically been separated out or struck down. And I don't think that's an accurate reading of the law, particularly when Roberts hinged the entire constitutional nature of the law on the taxing authority. So, but it seems like he and Kavanaugh are going to go that direction. And if they do, we lose again, despite having the majority. So we'll wait and see.
Definitely. And going off what you were saying earlier about Georgia and being part of the South and how it's now maybe a purple state instead of a red state, what do you think has happened since it has been a reliably red state since the 1992 election? And what do you think is causing the change? And then in your home state of Mississippi, could you see something like this happening down the road with changes in your area?
There's a couple of things that's happening here. Obviously, demographics does play a role, unfortunately. But I think if you have to blame someone for our loss of the younger generation, which we're literally losing big numbers among young people, it's because we're not communicating a clear, persuasive, conservative message. There's a book I read when I was in college. It was from Barry Goldwater, and I want you to read it if you get a chance. It's called The Conscience of a Conservative. It's the greatest primer of conservatism I've ever read. And when I read it, it motivated me. It made me kind of see for the first time what conservatism was and what it truly can be. We don't have messengers like that any longer. It seems to me that we are caught in some respects, just like the Democrats are, fighting for our established order, fighting for tribalism, that is R versus D, but somewhere along the way losing how important individual liberty is, not only to American society, but also to young people out there, because I believe they will respond to a message of individual liberty. And if you look at Goldwater and even Reagan and these messages they were alluding to back in the 60s and 70s and 80s, it was a party that wrapped its soul around freedom, a party that wrapped its soul around constitutional order. And one of the famous lines from Goldwater is, he wants to give you as much liberty as you can handle, consistent with social order. And when you talk to young people and you remind them of their place in society, and there's a price that we pay for the free things that we request, you'd be surprised how often they'll come to our way of thinking It's just we're not communicating that message. And we don't have good communicators right now, unfortunately. Look, it shouldn't surprise you. I'm not a fan of the established order. We need change.
Yeah.
We need conservatives in office that will speak their minds boldly. Reagan talked about that. Bold colors, not pastels. Drive a nice distinction between what you believe and what they believe. Because I'm going to tell you, if we're running as Democrat light, the voters will always choose the real Democrat over us every time. Give them an option. Be strong. Fight for your Constitution. Fight for your civil liberties. And you'll see those young people gravitate our direction. Until then, expect us to keep losing the millennials. And with what comes Generation Z, is that the next generation, the ones under that? So expect us to keep losing unless we can articulate a better message.
What sort of advice do you have for candidates who are trying to go up against the establishment, as you did, and also to Kelly's point, in a red state, a reliably red state, they may even still have trouble with the establishment?
It's funny. There are so many Republicans, but there are so few conservatives. Now, when Republicans run, they always run as conservatives. Have you noticed that? It's always the same talking points. They're going to reduce your taxes. They're going to keep government off your back. When they're elected, however, the second that hand goes up, something changes. Jefferson called it a rottenness of conduct. He said whenever a man places his eye or a woman places her eye on public office, a certain rottenness becomes their character. What happens with us is we're so busy trying to win elections, we've forgotten why we're running in the first place. We're so busy trying to win and moderate and compromise and surrender our principles, we've given the other side of the field of battle. It's incredibly difficult to fight against a system that's more concerned about being an R versus a D, as opposed to pushing the very principles it claims it supports. And that's the great frustration that I have right now, is because we have, for example, these great Republican numbers in these states, but we're not governing like Republicans. And when we call out those that aren't governing like Republicans, all of a sudden we're the bad guys. And all we're doing is saying, have you read the platform? Because we have a platform. It's just we go about abandoning the platform every chance we get. Look, be the conservative you were born to be. I promise you it's not outdated. It's not an antiquated doctrine. It's what gave America the greatest economy in the history of the world. It's what gave our people the greatest country in the history of the world. Classic conservative values and traditions work. But when you fight against the system, you should just know the system will fight back. And they'll fight back with every fiber of their being, because you're not just threatening an individual office, you're threatening a way of life. Because the political industrial complex that we have in DC, they make a fortune on the status quo. And as a person trying to change the status quo, they see me as a threat to that. And you know what? They're right. They're right. I hope to be a threat to that. And I hope you two are as well one day.
Definitely. And that's something that we at the Met Club, we are very conservative, and we support President Trump wholeheartedly and have enjoyed watching him try to fight against the establishment. But now it seems like maybe this might be his last hurrah against them. But we're holding out hope that things end up turning around in the next couple of weeks. But going off that, have you been surprised about which Republicans have been supporting President Trump the past week as he disputes the election, and also which ones have already called him out for not conceding yet?
It's funny. There's something to be said about the silence of our friends, right? When our friends are silent when we're going through a lot, that's a clear indication that perhaps they're not really our friends. I was really happy to see Ted Cruz come out in defense of President Trump, and I saw Rand Paul come out in defense of President Trump. He pointed out that our government sent 1.1 million people who had passed away stimulus checks. And his question was, if you're going to send 1.1 million people stimulus checks, how many of those folks may have voted in this past election, right? So I want to see more vocal support, not blind support, not the idea that a man is not infallible, because every man is fallible, every woman is fallible, but support based on fighting for what's right. I'll never understand silence in the face of corruption. I'll never understand silence in the face of fraud. And I know why they do it, because they're too concerned about their own political advancement than they are doing the right thing. And you'll find they'll lay low, and they'll hope this washes away, and then they'll come back up and they'll claim they were always for President Trump. The reality is they were never for it, not when it really mattered. I tell you something else is going to shock you. You're going to see a lot of these senators that over the last 2 or 3 years that have fought for President Trump. When he's no longer there, watch them, because I'm telling you, they will gravitate back toward the left, back to the established order, because they're going to go wherever they think their bread is going to be buttered. I think President Trump has been a breath of fresh air, if for no other reason than he spoke truth to power, so to speak. He was able to push back against those people and do his own thing. Now, was it unconventional? Yeah, at times. But wasn't it beautiful to watch somebody at least have the guts to stand up and push back for a while? But you know what? They don't like him for that. And that's why they're being so silent. So we'll have to wait and see what happens.
Some people have written in questions in advance for you. Someone, if fraud is uncovered and it's not enough to swing the election in the president's favor or even to persuade the courts, can the exposure of this fraud be used to prevent it from happening again, especially in 2024? Absolutely.
Let's just say, for example, that we find fraud out there, or irregularities, they call it. And there's enough attention, sunlight, brought to the irregularity that there's a fix or a correction. And if you fix enough of those, then certainly the election becomes more fair. That's what you're after. That's what you're after. Now, are you ever going to have a perfect election? Unfortunately not, because people are always going to be mischievous when it comes to these types of offices, because they're so powerful. But yeah, the idea is if he does fight now, which is why he should fight now, even if he, for whatever reason, can't find enough to close the gap, at least he shined a light on some of this corruption. And that's a worthy fight. I mean, that's a good fight. I think that's something that anytime we can root out corruption, even if it's minor, we owe it to ourselves to work to do that. So yeah, I think that's a good point for sure.
What would your advice be for the president moving forward in the next couple of weeks as he continues to contest the election?
Not to get your hopes down, not to be in despair. I can tell you that when you run a race and you work so hard, and he did work hard. I mean, if you might remember that last 10 or 15 days, he was doing 4 and 5 events, and that takes a lot out of a person. It may look fun, but I promise you, when you're standing up there giving one speech after the other, especially, what is he, 74 years old?
Yep.
That's gonna exhaust you, and yet he went out there and fought. So what happens is the first feeling you have is disappointment. I mean, nobody likes to lose, and it happens from time to time, and God gives us examples of that throughout our childhood, whether it's basketball or football or baseball. But still, you work so hard, and it's so close. I would rather lose by 50 points as opposed to 1 point, right? Because when it's close, you always second guess, what could I have done differently? Mm-hmm. And I'm sure he's going through that right now, and it's very painful. So our prayer is that he's strong, that he works through the anguish and the pain, and that he comes out a stronger person on the back end of this, because there's so many lessons we can all learn from this. And, you know, Trump's career is not over. If he prevails in the challenge, hey, it's going to be outstanding. But if he doesn't prevail, he's not the kind of guy that's just going to walk away, yeah. Right? There's going to be opportunities for him. And so I pray that he sees those opportunities and that he works to further conservatism whenever he can. That's my prayer for him.
So if he does win, obviously we're hoping for that, we're praying for that. But what do you think some of the fallout might be socially?
Oh, my goodness. Well, you know how the Democrats have behaved. Mm-hmm. You know how the far left wing has behaved. I mean, these people were rioting in the streets, and they seem to have no respect for the law. Now, I know I'm stereotyping, so you'll have to forgive me, because they're going to pull this out later and say that I called every Democrat unlawful or whatever the case may be. But I can tell you this, in the inner cities, in the bigger cities where they're controlled by Democrat majorities, Democrat mayors, city council, they seem to have turned relatively a blind eye to that nonsense. Mm-hmm. And when you turn a blind eye to violence and destruction, it just encourages violence and destruction. So if they've turned a blind eye once because individuals felt like they were not unhappy or disenfranchised, whatever the case may be, can you only imagine what would happen if these results were reversed? Mm. Now, I'll be the first to tell you, Justice is justice and right is right. So you can't, as a judge, let that enter into your consideration. Do the right thing, and then expect the authorities in those cities to do the right thing. But I tell you this, as a conservative, I'm incredibly frustrated in these cities and that they allow the unlawful conduct. They allow the destruction. Tourism taxes go down. People don't visit. They can't raise money for their pet projects. What's the first thing they do? They ask us to bail them out.
Mm-hmm.
That can't happen. If you're going to allow that nonsense in your city, you've got to live with the results of the nonsense. And so, look, to answer your question, there will be violence. There'll be riots because the liberals have shown us over the last few months that's the way they behave when they don't get their way.
Right. They definitely have normalized violence, and I could speak, also for Kelly. I'm sure feels similarly in New York. It was shocking to see the mass celebrations for Biden. Obviously, the Republicans, it's 70 million Americans, yet not one riot. Really, maybe there was, but really not to the same extent as to what we might expect from the other side if President Trump were to win at the Supreme Court.
It's a tale of two countries.
Mm-hmm.
Make no mistake, on one side of the country, you have people that still value law and order. Mm-hmm. You have people that still value the Constitution, that still value, for the most part, civic discourse. On the other side of the equation, you have people that have made victimhood a celebrity. Mm-hmm. And they would rather be aggrieved and angry and violent than they would be civil. It's a tale of two countries. And unfortunately, I don't think it's going away anytime soon. I don't think it matters to them what the results of this election are or is. I think ultimately, if they don't get their way on any given project, if they don't get their way in any given vote, they're going to behave the way they've already behaved. It's an example in bad leadership and an example of the way people should not conduct themselves in a free society. Mm-hmm. But Republicans and conservatives need to say that. We can't cower away from the mob. If the mob is going to be violent, if they're going to be destructive, we owe it to the people, the good people of this country, to stand in the gap and say, no more. That's not going to happen on my watch. And Trump was trying to do that. It's just he wasn't getting much cooperation in Chicago, in New York, and other places because of Democratic control.
Going off that, obviously, so many people have been celebrating, and Trump supporters, unfortunately, have been silenced throughout this whole election and cancel culture. But in terms of Biden himself, now he's calling himself the president-elect and talking to world leaders and all these things. And Facebook is putting all these notifications on any piece of content that even mentions fraud, that the election results have already been called. So what's your take on all that?
It's funny. Joe Biden has basically created a new office. Who knew there was an office of president-elect? I had no idea that even existed. And if you look behind him when he speaks, there's a label like he has this new official office. Look, the election hasn't been certified yet. Joe Biden's a civilian. That's what Joe Biden is. He's a civilian. And until the election is certified, that's all he will be. I don't think it's a wise idea for conservatives to take their marching orders from CNN or MSNBC. I don't think that's very wise. And if they want to call the election, certainly they may. That's their prerogative. But until the race is certified, Joe Biden is just a civilian. I do think it's a stretch. I saw CNN saying earlier that this was a threat to national security. Isn't that amazing? I think they've lost all credibility. The idea that somehow President Trump is now causing a threat to national security, as if there aren't safeguards, as if there aren't redundant systems in place to make sure these things don't happen. This parade of horribles CNN is suggesting. Look, they want to hasten the result. They want Trump to concede. They don't want an investigation. And so they say all these things to make people uncomfortable. And it's our job to remind people that there's nothing that makes us more comfortable than finding the truth. Mm-hmm. And so transparency goes a long way there. So it's going to be really interesting.
Well, on that note, I wanted to say thank you so much for joining us this evening. And for everyone too, it's Veterans Day, so we want to pay homage to those who fought for our country so that we can be a democracy and continue this conversation. It's incredibly important. As an aside, we also are encouraging people in the Met Club especially to join other sites like Parler, maybe either, some other groups that won't be as censored as Facebook, Twitter, and big tech has in the past. But again, where can we find you, and where can we engage in a conversation with you?
I tell you, I've always been pretty big on Facebook, obviously. I do a lot of things there. Senator McDaniel, just Senator Chris McDaniel, just spell it out there. Same with Parler. I just joined a bit ago, and it's the same thing, Senator McDaniel.
Okay.
Parler. So come be a part. We have these Q&As a lot. We engage a lot with people because I still feel like, I know this is a crazy thought, that I work for y'all.
You
And
do.
I work for the people of this country. They don't work for me. I'm their employee. And so I owe it to them to be transparent. And you all have done a great job tonight. So thank you very much. And I noticed you're both New Yorkers, right?
We are.
You didn't say a thing about my Ted Williams picture here behind me. You didn't say a thing about my Red Sox picture behind me. You missed it.
Oh, no, we didn't see it.
That was designed to instigate the New Yorkers up there just a bit, to get them fired up. But I still love you guys.
The interview would have been much shorter had we seen it before.
Funny. Hey, you guys have enough World Series. It's time you share some with us for a change.
You won more in the 21st century than the Yankees have. So.
Hey, you know what? That's a fluke. What do you have, 26? You have 26?
27.
Oh, I'm sorry. I missed one. My bad. and my beloved Cubs, which I love the Red Sox too, my Cubs have 3. Let that sink in. 3. So you guys have won enough. It's time to let other teams have a go at this. And, but it's been fun to watch for sure.
Well, Senator McDaniel, thank you so much for your time and your insights, and we appreciate it. And again, everyone, take care and stay well, especially in the upcoming weeks.
Thank you very much for having me.